Let's talk about drugs. This is actually the first interview on the RxTales podcast, and I have a really special guest with me today. I have Stephen Hall. If you don't know who he is, you really should. Stephen Hall has spent a decade as a curator of the Coit Museum of Pharmacy and Health Sciences at the University of Arizona. And part of his role there is he is the caretaker of one of the coolest collections of pharmacy memorabilia that exists probably in the United States. But I don't want to take too much. I'd like to let him tell his own story. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So, first off, drugs and Disney. What's the connection there?
Yeah, this is something that you might not expect to find in there a connection there, but there's a long-standing connection between pharmacy and Disney in the form of the Upjohn Pharmacy. This was a Main Street attraction in Disneyland in California. Day one attraction when the park opened in 1955. There was a replica of an old apothecary shop on Main Street sponsored by the Upjohn Company. They were a big drug manufacturer based in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And today they're under Pfizer. They're not really around in their old form anymore, but they're a subsidiary today of Pfizer. But from 1955 until 1970, the first 15 years of the park, there was this replica pharmacy right on Main Street that was a popular attraction for Disneyland tourists. And it also sort of spoke to the larger state of the pharmacy profession and how it was changing in the mid 20th century.
I mean, absolutely fascinating. It's one of those things that you really wouldn't expect to find a connection with, especially at Disneyland. So at the museum where you're at, you've kind of created this whole new space, right? Just to showcase the Upjohn Pharmacy collection. I guess let's go back and talk about Walt Disney himself, right? I, what is Walt Disney's connection with Upjohn?
Sure. So to give some context about where I'm coming to this from, as you mentioned, just for your listeners to understand as well. So I was the curator, as you said, of the Coit Museum at the University of Arizona from 2014 until 2022. And so for that, and I was a volunteer there a little bit beforehand. So for about 10 years, I was working in this museum that is home to the Upjohn Pharmacy collection, all these artifacts that were on display in this Disneyland store. So then where Walt Disney comes into this picture from, the whole Upjohn Pharmacy, the whole project involved grew out of a friendship between Walt Disney, the man, and a gentleman named Donald Gilmore. So Don Gilmore was the head of the Upjohn Company, again, this pharmaceutical company in Michigan. The two men were part-time neighbors. So Don Gilmore lived in the Kalamazoo Portage area in West Michigan, where the company was headquartered. And so obviously he's there most of the year doing work there. But when it's freezing cold in Michigan in the wintertime, he would escape to Palm Springs, California. And so he had a vacation home, a winter home at a place called the Smoke Tree Ranch in Palm Springs, which is famously the place where Walt Disney lived. And so in the winter months, these two men were living in the same community. They were friends. They were lawn bowling partners. So they were colleagues, both, executive in big companies. And even when Don Gilmore was in Michigan the rest of the year, the two men would write each other letters. They stayed in touch all the time, and they were very good friends. A lot of their letters are archived in various museums around West Michigan. So there's a whole trail of recording their friendship. But it was because there was already this existing connection between the two heads of these companies that the Upjohn Pharmacy was kind of a natural outgrowth of that. There's a little bit of an irony here, though, in that Don Gilmore was not the one that actually came up with it. So there's a third player as well in this story, a man named Jack Gauntlet. So Don Gilmore, again, was the head of the company. Jack Gauntlet was the advertising director of Upjohn. So he was in charge of all the media campaigns and marketing and stuff for the whole company. And he had gotten wind of this thing that Walt Disney was building in California, this magical theme park, fairy park, whatever he was making. And he heard that Walt Disney was looking for corporate sponsors. And so he saw the potential here of if Walt is recreating this kind of old town American small town vibe in this new theme park, a part of any American small town was the pharmacy. And here's a chance for Upjohn to insert itself into this hugely successful public forum where it'll be seen by millions of people every year. And so Jack Gauntlet actually was the one that came up with the idea. The real kicker, though, is that when he approached Don Gilmore with this idea, Jack Gauntlet didn't know that there was already a connection between Gilmore and Disney. He didn't know that those two men were friends.
He
So
didn't even know.
he had this idea genuinely, independently, on his own, truly his idea, without any knowledge of the existing connection. But then, of course, when he brought Don Gilmore in, it's, well, let me call my friend Walt and we'll make it happen. And so it was just a very fortuitous situation. And there were more players that would get involved as time went on that were very instrumental in making this happen. And the whole story of the Upjohn Pharmacy is a story of all the right people being just in the right place with the right knowledge base to make something really special happen.
That's really fascinating. Like, what are the odds where,
Right,
you have this great idea and you bring it to your boss and say, man, we should do something with Disney. And like everybody knew who Disney was at
right,
the time.
right. If only we
And
had a way to get to Walt Disney.
right. And he's like, oh, yeah, I play on this bowling team. You know,
Right, right,
it, it's really crazy to think how so much of it's not just this story, but it's really everything in history. It seems is it's just the right combination of people, like you said, at the right place and time. And and it's really fascinating that it happens to be Walt Disney, who was a super famous guy at that time. So that's really crazy. So he's good buddies with Don Gilmore, and he's, creating Disneyland, and Gauntlet gets this idea that, hey, we should do some co-branding stuff here. And okay, so pharmacy fits really well into that, like, Americana, old school kind of almost like an idealized version of, American history, and that time period where people think, oh yeah, that was the good old days.
right. The good old days, right.
Yeah. You ask people now, like, it's a boomer thing. Sorry, boomers.
It
You
it is a
well,
boomer thing. You're right.
well, people say, "Oh, the good old days," and like you say, when they say, "Oh, yeah, like the '50s," and the people in the '50s are saying, "Yeah, the good old days were actually like the 1890s."
Right. It's always wherever we are minus 30 to 50 years is the good old days. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's great because if you go down, like, Disney World, Disneyland, that Main Street USA vibe, that's pretty much what they're going for. So talk a little bit more about kind of your research into Upjohn's history then. And, as you started digging into this relationship and how this idea came about, how did the actual Disney, the Upjohn component of Disneyland on its opening day, no less, how did that kind of come to fruition?
Well, sure. So, I mean, you mentioned small towns and pharmacies being a part of Americana, and that's absolutely right. I mean, if you were talking about folks from older generations, every single one of them has memories of drugstores from their childhood, and the reason is because drugstores were a pivotal part of American small town life. And the fact is, America was built on small towns. Nowadays we have much bigger sprawling cities, LA, New York, Chicago. And those cities, of course, were big back then, but there was much more of there was many more small towns in the country. For example, I mean, the town where Walt Disney grew up was Marceline, Missouri. The one thing that's famous for is being the place where Walt Disney grew up. Here in Arizona, where I am, I mean, there was all kinds of like copper mining boom towns, which are now all long gone. They were there for 5 or 10 years, but it's small towns were really the heart line of America. And pharmacies fit into that because in many cases, a pharmacy was, or I mean, an apothecary, as it might have been called back in the time, was often the only really place of any medical help in a town. I mean, if you think about a little tiny rural town, you don't have big hospital infrastructure like you would in Philadelphia or New York, which had much longer history, much bigger populations, much better infrastructure. Small towns didn't have that. And so if there's an apothecary, often that might be the only person who has any kind of medical knowledge. And so the pharmacy was kind of by default the center of healthcare in many American small towns, including those where Walt Disney lived. And so I think this is part of why pharmacy is so closely related or so closely considered within the context of Americana. And so what Disney was creating with Main Street was, as he called it, the America of 1890 to 1910, at quote the crossroads of an era. So he was trying to find that time right when you're seeing new technologies kind of come in. He would talk about how, the stagecoach is being replaced with new cars, and gas lamps on the streets are being replaced with electric lights. So kind of this really pivotal turning point, which again was, as you said, was the good old days in the 50s, was the 1910s or something, pre-World War II, pre-Great Depression, pre-World War I, in fact. I mean, before a lot of bad things happened, this is a good nostalgic time. And so that was the time period that Walt sought to recreate, not coincidentally the time of his youth. I mean, that's when he was a young boy.
Mm. Yeah.
And so Walt was thinking about, well, what are the things that represent Americana? And so, on Main Street, there was all kinds of, I mean, Upjohn was just one of many shops. There was a Bank of America branch. There was, weirdly, I kid you not, there was a brassiere shop called, and I swear this is true, the Wizard of Bras. I kid you not.
That was a real thing.
That was a real thing. You can look it up. But the Carnation ice cream parlor, all these places that would be associated with small town life, and of course the pharmacy was pivotal in that. And so it worked out really well for Upjohn, because again, if Walt was recreating this 1890 to 1910 timeframe, well, Upjohn was founded in 1886, so that lines up pretty perfectly, just about perfectly. So those very early years of Upjohn were literally in the time that Walt Disney was recreating. So Upjohn kind of had this unique opportunity to insert its own story, its own history into this broader picture of like a microcosm of American history.
Pretty fascinating, because they would have just been hitting their heyday in the 1880s. 1880s was like, to 1906, we'll say. It's like this super, ultra capitalism version of the pharmaceutical industry in the US, right? This is before there's any regulations whatsoever. But you have all the technology. So there's no rules about what you can or can't do, what you can't put into a bottle and sell, how you can market it, whether you have to be honest about
Right.
what's in it or what it does. Make any
Right.
claims you want. But you've got all this technology that enables you to market a product super effectively in new ways and deliver it all over the country. You've got the railroad network, you've got the telegraph, and you've got chromolithography. So you can
Right.
make these high quality, cheap color advertisements.
It looked
And so,
beautiful. Right. Right.
and everybody at the time had those. And I mean, it's just a perfect time. That's why I think we see so many pharmaceutical companies really start up in that 1880s time period.
It was like 1860s to 1890s or 1900. There's like a 30 to 40-year window where we really did see the pharmacy industry, I would call it, kind of come into its own. Prior to that, for the whole pharmaceutical world was really based on small proprietor-owned apothecary shops. But in that late 1800s, 1860s to 1900 era, we saw companies like Johnson and Johnson, Park Davis, Upjohn, all kinds of these companies that are now giants in the field. They were just getting started. So as you mentioned, this capitalism, that was right around this time. And Upjohn was one of these. It started out as a small family business run out of a basement in West Michigan, grew into this multinational conglomerate with blockbuster medications. I mean, it really was a kind of and that notion of the story of rags to riches also kind of fits into this American dream, this idealized, starting from nothing and making it big. It all kind of blends nicely with what Walt was trying to do with this idealized rose-colored version of American history where everything was
Yeah. And And in a lot of ways, like you said, that was the nostalgic ideal. That's what people in the 50s would think about as the good old days.
right,
And oh man, things were so much simpler back then. Yeah, because you didn't have to follow any rules.
right,
You could just do whatever you wanted. I mean, it's a period in time that, again, like you said, it's rose-colored glasses. It's a very, idealized way of looking back at the past. And pharmacy fits really specifically into that. I like what you said about the connection between small towns and how, people think back, because a lot of people move from small towns to the cities. And so when you think about your past, you think about, small towns. I'm from a small town, and my first job was in a 150-year-old pharmacy,
Mm, yeah.
and I loved it, man. It was the best thing ever. They had all these they even had their own patent medicines back in the day. So,
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that you would actually bring up patent medicines because 'cause you're talking about how there was no rule. There was no laws, no regulations, and that's exactly right. That's a really important point here because if we're talking about these good old days, in terms of pharmacy and health science, they really were not good old days. They were, in fact, very not good days. These were times when like you said, you could sell anything as a medication: cocaine, alcohol, morphine, heroin, you name it, and they did. And there was all kinds of problems that resulted from this. Of course, addiction and death resulted from this, which would ultimately lead to things like the Food and Drug Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the FDA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, all kinds of these consumer safety regulations that we now just take for granted, but they really were a result of these terrible times in pharmacy that we were pretending were good times.
you're absolutely right. I mean, it was 1898, there's this article that came out and referred to America as a nation of drug addicts, because of the availability of all these, highly potent, totally unregulated concoctions that are being sold, not to mention dangerous. And that's, I think, the byproduct of every, technological advancement of industrialization. Whenever we have a new technology, we do whatever we do with it as humans, and then we figure out, okay, here are some problems that are showing. Now let's try to regulate it. And so it's this cycle that keeps repeating itself over and over. And
Yeah, it's worth noting that so the Upjohn company predated all those regulations. I mean, again, they were 1880s founded. And so they could have been a part of the problem, selling cocaine and other such compounds, but they didn't. So from the very earliest days, W.E. Upjohn, the founder, really made a point to have quality. And in fact, in the tagline of the company for its entire life was "Keep the quality up." That was from even before there were regulations that required them to do so. The Upjohn company sought to let the quality of their products speak for itself. We don't need to do cheap, dangerous patent medicines to make a quick buck. We're going to make things that are actually good or actually better than what's available and just let that speak for itself. So,
that is number one, that's really affirming because when you think back to that time, it that was a good solid marketing strategy, is appealing to the consumer's desire to, like, people knew that there was no rules. People knew that there could be anything in there. And like, if you've got a product, now you're saying, look, my product is pure, unadulterated. It's the real deal, and there's nothing untainted in it, and I'll put the ingredients on the bottle. You know, Heinz does the same thing back in the 1890s, advertising its products as, pure or pure foods. There's like this whole pure food movement going on at
right.
the time. And, again, we see that over and over again. But it's really important, I think, to note what you just pointed out. Like, not everybody was shady and trying to pull one over on unsuspecting
Right.
consumers.
Right.
A lot of business owners were ethical and really did stand behind their product. And, pharmacists in general, right, have always been folks that, tend to look out for the public health, and I think overwhelmingly try to do what's best in terms of, taking care of the patients. So, eh, this old-timey pharmacy notion, there's a lot of things that the pharmacies did in those days, just because the business model was evolving, right? It wasn't like the CVS of today in some respects, because these pharmacies, like you said, were like the only game in town for healthcare. But they did a lot of other things too, right? Some of the things you talk about here were some of the things that pharmacies would do that eh, I think people were nostalgic for. Talk a little bit about some of that.
Sure. So again, you have to, like you said, you have to think about pharmacy is not what you think of it as today. Today, you think of big chains, Walgreens, CVS, et cetera, Rite Aid, big giant corporations with hundreds and hundreds of locations across the country, multi-billion dollars. It was not like that. Pharmacies were largely one person operations, or maybe a few people. Usually a pharmacist or an apothecary might own one or maybe three or four, maybe if they're doing really well, apothecaries in a town. But really it was a individual proprietor owned business. a small business in a small town. I mean, and it's a little bit weird to think of that today because it's so not how the profession is, but that is indeed how it was back then. And so, because of that, the fact is medications only brought in so much revenue. I mean, it was obviously an important service for a community, but by themselves, just selling medications probably was often not enough to really sustain a thriving business. And so, to supplement that, pharmacies did a bunch of other things too. And this is something that a lot of people, again, when we think about reminiscing on the good old days, this is the kind of thing people remember. Pharmacies would always have jars full of candy on the counter for kids to reach their grimy hands into. They would often have a lunch counter where they would serve hot meals. They would have ice cream machines, soda fountains. Many people know Coca-Cola originated in pharmacy. Yes, that's true. And yes, that other thing about Coca-Cola is also true. But they did all kinds of these other revenue streams because ultimately that's what helped to make their business stay solvent. Selling toys, comic books, bubble gum, tobacco. I mean, all kinds of things. So
Yeah.
really they were sort of like almost general stores, like mercantile type stores. Of course, medicine was really the primary offering, but there was a whole bunch behind that as well. One thing that is probably my favorite connection here is about the connection between photography and pharmacy. So this may be surprising to hear, but since the earliest days of film photography, that practice has been connected to pharmacy, and the reason is because if you're doing photography on film, you need chemicals, silver nitrate, pyrogallic acid, various other photographic chemicals in order to develop pictures. And so if you were getting into photography as this new burgeoning medium, where do you go? You can't just go and buy pyrogallic acid just at a grocery store. You'd have to go to the place that sells chemicals. And so pharmacies, of course, already had things like silver nitrate. They use it for various things in medications. So they already had, they already stocked it. They already had supply lines set up with distributors. So when photography comes out, it's like, oh, this new artistic medium, and a lot of people are getting into it. Well, pharmacy saw this great opportunity for here's another really awesome revenue stream with stuff that we already have and we already use. We just buy a little more of it and put out on the sales floor as photographic equipment. But the real kicker then is we still see this connection today because when you need to get digital photos printed, oftentimes what you do is you go to Walgreens or CVS because they always have a photo counter. But if you step back and look at that, it's like, why do they have a photo counter? That doesn't really seem like that would be connected at all, but that is the historical connection. It's just always been like.
Absolutely. I remember when I started in pharmacy in the around the year 2000, digital cameras were not really popular and out there yet. They hadn't evolved. They were like super expensive. So people were still using like 8 millimeter film or not, what's it, 35? I don't know what the millimeter is, but they were using film. The point was you had a camera. You had the disposable cameras at the time, but you would take this little roll of film, a little plastic case, you take it down to the pharmacy. And so our pharmacy had a photo department in the front end, and they had literally like jugs of chemicals that were used in I don't know, these big machines. I really didn't work in that part, but I remember just seeing the big gallon jugs of all these chemicals that were used to develop the film. And up until, people had smartphones and like now I can just take and store a bajillion pictures on my phone, but that was it. And that was such a crucial part. I remember at weddings, people would like hand out disposable cameras and then you'd have to like pay to get all the film developed. And that's a big money maker. I mean,
Sure.
you'd pay like what, 8, 10 bucks or more to have and a roll of film had what, like 20, 25 pictures on it, something like that.
Yeah, and odds are at least one of them, your finger was over the
Right?
shutter anyway, yeah. No, but I
Man.
mean, yeah, this is a long-standing connection that we still see today, even though film photography is, like you said, really not a thing anymore. I mean, except in, like, very, auteur kind of circles.
Yeah.
The connection remains nonetheless.
No, it's still that, like you said, there's still a photo department in the Walgreens where now it's a kiosk. You just print your Bluetooth it and you print right from your phone. But it's so cool to see how that connection is still there.
Yeah, because if like I said, if you just look at that at face value, it's like, why is this here? Like, it seems kind of like a random thing to have, like, in a pharmacy, but I mean, but even still today, we do see pharmacies, they have a snack aisle, they have, little toys you can buy and
Oh,
greeting
yeah.
cards and stuff, and it's always been like that. I mean, even like makeup and cosmetics, in fact, were really also kind of not originated, but were really pharmacies were really important in the development of makeup and cosmetics. Because again, they're compounded. It's lotions and perfumes. So and that's why today in Walgreens there still is like a whole cosmetics aisle. It's just always been
Mhm.
like
No, that's such a great point. It's fascinating. You think about how pharmacies just interconnected. The pharmacy I worked at when I was in high school that was super old, they had a jewelry counter.
yeah,
And they had, again, the candy, they had the soda fountain and the lunch counter. You could get like a hamburger at the pharmacy.
yeah.
And you could smoke inside in those days. And so people would like smoke cigars and read the paper and just hang out all day.
The good old days, right?
Oh, yeah. They had a sign in the window that said electric shaver repair every Tuesday. Like, you could literally bring your electric razor in, and there was just a dude who would tinker with it in the back. And he'd fix your, like, Norelca or whatever.
That's and this is the kind I think it's stuff like this that makes these so nostalgic and so pivotal to Americana because everyone who is, I would say, Gen X or older has memories like this. And often, I've in my work at the museum, I met tons of people who would tell me stories about a specific pharmacist that they remembered, Dr. Andrews or whatever, who was the proprietor, who, one time I was riding my bike, I scraped my knee, he gave me a Band-Aid, gave me a piece of candy, and like that just has kind of it just becomes kind of like a touchstone for people when they think about their youth. I mean, for me, it's like I think about like, oh, Blockbuster Video was so great. For a lot of people, it's, oh yeah, the pharmacy was such a great place. And
Well,
really, yeah, and it was just a perfect inclusion for Disneyland anyway.
yeah, I mean, because like one thing Walt Disney did really well, and I mean, you can go and talk about the ethics of Disney all over the board, but one thing Walt Disney did really good, and I think you have to give him credit for, is he was very in touch with American consciousness. He really understood what evoked those powerful feelings in the American people and made them just desire to be part of that and how to sell nostalgia at scale. And it's so cool, and it makes sense, right? That pharmacy was part of that. So tell me about what was the Upjohn exhibit like? What was the Upjohn store in Disneyland? What was it like inside?
Sure. So the Upjohn store was made to look like, as you'd imagine, an old apothecary. So it was not grandiose. It was not big. It was a little shop on Main Street on a corner, which again, a corner drugstore. That's not an accident that it was on the corner. It was this little shop with beautiful bay windows around the edge. Here, I mean, I'll plug for a second. This is the book, and it has all the pictures of it in there. But there's the inside was made to look like a Victorian apothecary, full of apothecary jars and vessels, shelf bottles, show globes, beautiful countertops, and just all kinds of all the things that you would find in a real drugstore. And the pieces were authentic. They were, some people might have thought like, well, they probably just fabricated a bunch of stuff to make it look old. No, they were actually the real deal.
Wow.
And I was mentioning earlier Don Gilmore and Jack Gauntlet. Like I said, there was a few other people. One of them was a man named Gerard McLeod. He was on staff at Upjohn, and by coincidence, he was an avid collector of medical antiques. He was a doctor, a physician by trade, but he also was just an antique enthusiast. And so when they started this project, they sent him all over the country, just buying up at estate sales, antique shops, old pharmacies, whatever he could find. And so he went and bought over 1,000 of these beautiful pieces that would all wind up in the pharmacy. And then later, of course, in the museum where I was caring for them. But the Upjohn pharmacy then also had a secondary exhibit as well. It was a smaller kind of back room exhibit where it was about a look at like modern contemporary pharmacy as it looked in the 50s and 60s. So it was made to look like this kind of space age aesthetic with dramatic lighting and big transparencies on the wall and these four illuminated columns that would rotate and show the process of drug development. So it was very different than what you'd see in the main exhibit, but that was kind of on purpose, and it was Upjohn's way of saying, like, here's where pharmacy was, but here's where we are now, and Upjohn is at the forefront of it. They're trying to position themselves as like we're the ones leading the charge, which they really in some ways were. But it was
So it was kind of just a good branding
sure.
opportunity. Yeah.
I mean, and that's really the bottom line of the whole thing. That's always what it was. Some people might say, well, yeah, like you said, the ethics of Disney, and they're showing history in a way that it really wasn't. Well, yeah, that's true. But what Upjohn was doing and what Disney was doing never was to set out to show accurate history. What they're doing is they're selling a product, and they did a dang good job of it too. I mean, that was
Yeah.
always the bottom line, was marketing and branding.
Well, I mean, and Upjohn did have like some credibility to stand on, right? Like they came up with some innovative, patented pharmaceutical techniques, right? They came up with, I know there was something about that. It was at the crushable pill,
Yeah, the Fryable pill.
Fryable pill. Yeah.
This was the thing that actually kicked off the whole entire company in
Wow.
1886. So it's important to sort of to know how pills were made prior to this. And the process of making pills was very laborious.
Hmm.
They would all, of course, all had to be made by hand. They would have to be, compounded, rolled out like almost like bread dough, baked. I mean, it was a whole lengthy process, and then there was a number of problems that went along with this. One, of course, is labor intensive. Two, you have variance in dosage. One might get more or less, bigger or smaller. So there's variations from one to another. They're time intensive to make. You can't make them at scale. There's all kinds of problems. And W.E. Upjohn, the founder of the company, what made them successful was this idea of the friable pill. So this was absolutely game-changing innovation in pharmacy. So W.E. Upjohn made this invention. He was kind of a tinkerer. And he made this invention that it's been described as like a rotating drum tilted at 45 degrees that spins around. And what he would do is he would start with, like grains of sugar, just kind of sent rolling in a, random tumble in this machine. And he'd slowly add in the active drug ingredients, and it spins around and kind of mixes it almost like a cement mixer.
Okay.
And then as you add in, a thickening agent and stuff, what it creates is, in bulk, it creates pills that are, because it's all, randomly done, they all tended to be pretty even in size. So you had better dosage reliability. You could make them in large batches. So it took out the hand making them. It made them so they didn't have to be baked anymore. And they would ultimately be more effective, because when you'd have to bake pills back in the day, they would often be really hard, really like rigid. And so what that would mean is, if you took one, more than likely it would go right through your system without really ever taking effect, because it's too hard for your body to break down in the time that it's moving through your body. So at best, all pills prior to this would be pretty ineffective. At worst, sometimes they were coated in things like silver, which could even be toxic. So, but because these were soft pills that Upjohn had created, that meant that they would digest, or they would absorb very quickly after you took them, providing fast relief and more reliably so. So the word friable, meaning it can be crushed. It was like powdery rather than a little pebble or something. And so
Mhm.
just in all of the problems that existed with pills prior to that, this one invention solved every one of them. And so it was this total revolution in the drug manufacturing process that really catapulted Upjohn into instant success.
Wow. It sounds really familiar to how they make like candy. Like I think about like Skittles or other, coated candies where they tumble them in a, I don't know, a tumbler thing with sugar and whatnot. So it makes total sense. I mean, I'm sure, and it made them a lot of money because when we're talking about drugs, a lot of drugs have like this, like what we call a narrow therapeutic index, where, it's a really small range where below this, it doesn't work, and above it, it's toxic. You don't want that. So getting that dose accurate is such a big part of making a good pharmaceutical product. So what a cool thing. So what were some of Upjohn's what are some of the things they were most famous for, their
Sure,
products?
sure. There's a number of them because they were around for more than 100 years. And so
Wow.
in that, it was 1886 to 1995. So just 109 years they were around, and they had a number of big blockbusters. Of course, the Fryable pill was, again, the thing that really started everything. The Fryable pill was a revolution, but it actually quickly became replaced with the advent of a tablet press. So Upjohn had this great idea that was truly a great idea, but within like a decade or so, tablet presser machines came and essentially replaced that. So their success was short-lived, and they actually almost went under. But they came out with a drug called Phenolax that really saved the whole company. So Phenolax was the first ever like pleasant tasting laxative drug. People's diets back then were often like they were not great. And so there was a lot of reliance on laxative, and most of the ones on the market tasted bad. Upjohn made one that was actually palatable, and it sold like gangbusters.
Wow.
Later on, they made in more like in the first half of the 20th century, they made, things like Cheracol cough syrup. They made kaopectate. That's one that a lot of people would remember, kaopectate and Cheracol. And then, Unicap vitamins, which I actually have one here. This is
Wow.
the Disneyland. This is the bottle of Unicap vitamins that you'd get at the Upjohn Pharmacy. There's the Disneyland apple. So that was another, kind of big one that they made.
Wow.
But I mean, they had lots of success over many years. They had ups and downs, but it seems like each time they had a hit, it was a big giant hit.
Man. I mean, that's the way it goes with drug manufacturing, but I want to go back to your what you just showed us there. That was fantastic. So at Disneyland, right?
Yeah.
You would literally be able to walk into the Upjohn Pharmacy on Main Street, USA in the 50s, like day one, right? The museum's there. You walk in, you've got all these like pharmaceutical antiques and like maybe the big jars of colored liquid and
Yeah,
all the old timey stuff, right? And he's got it staffed with like real pharmacists.
that's right.
And so at the end of like walking through the thing, exit through the gift shop, right? But you get your free sample of Unicap
Right,
vitamins.
right. Again, it's all marketing. It's all branding. I mean,
Wow.
so yeah, the Upjohn Pharmacy was not actually, like a working retail pharmacy. You couldn't actually,
Right.
like, you couldn't buy anything there. And of course, like, you're not gonna get like a script filled there.
Right. Right.
Well, again, it was just for show, just for marketing. But yeah, the Unicap vitamins, which was a big product that they were pushing in that mid-century, anyone who came through got a little bottle of them. You can find them on eBay. I think I got that one for like 40-50 bucks on eBay.
Wow.
I mean, they gave them out by the millions, so they're not really very hard to come by. One thing that is kind of hard to come by is this one. So it's a photo holder that says a memento from the Upjohn Company in Disneyland, and it's a little photo envelope here, and these were given out only to like medical professionals who would come through. So everyone who came through got the vitamin bottle, but they had a very few of these photo holders that they'd give out, like if a pharmacist or a doctor came, and
Yeah.
so those are much harder to come by.
Yeah.
That,
So
that's
this is like the special behind the counter
That's
stuff.
like
Like,
that's like
hey,
my that's my special prized possession, yeah, yeah, I don't think I've ever even seen one of those on eBay.
I've never seen one of those either. That's fantastic.
Yeah, even, like, hardcore Disney nerds probably have, like, they've all seen the vitamin bottle, probably have not seen that before.
That's a whole nother crossover that it exists out there somewhere, right? Like, when I started this endeavor of talking about pharmacy history, I always when I get in conversations with people, who maybe again most people don't know anything about pharmacy history, and I start talking to them about it, and it's full of stories. It's just a great story all along. And people are just amazed. They love it. They're enthralled. They're rapt. And they're like, wow, I never knew that existed. And like Disney is something that a ton of people are into. I mean, millions of people go to Disney World every year. It's one of the biggest businesses in America. They own everything now. And so everybody's interested in Disney, but to find people that are interested in pharmacy and Disney, that's a rare crossover. So
Right, and, that really is how this book that I wrote about Upjohn, that's really how this came to be. So, when I was starting out in the museum, we had this fabulous collection, and, like, as the curator, obviously, it's important that I know the history, the context, the stories associated with it, so that I can share those with guests and visitors and researchers. And very quickly after I started working there, and I'm doing my own research trying to learn about, what is this? Where's it all from? My background was not in pharmacy, by the way. So, but I was trying to, learn as much as I could. And I very quickly realized, like, man, there's been almost nothing ever written about this. Like, ever, which struck me as very strange because, like you said, medical history, yeah, is a little bit more of a niche, but it's still, there's a lot of people that are interested in it. And Disney history is huge. Disneyland, everyone loves Disneyland and Disney history. And so I'm like, it's crazy to me that this intersection of these two things that are pretty widely enjoyed. No one's ever really written about this. And I remember thinking, man, someone really should write. And then it kind of hit me. I'm like, I guess I'm in the position to do that. So that was kind of how this all came to be. But like, it's a story that really had never been told before. And it was just a labor of love to write it.
that's awesome. So tell me a little bit more about your book. I've got it here. This is a great book. One thing I love about it, it's produced by an independent publisher. It is extremely reasonably priced, but it's beautiful. This book, one thing I was amazed at was the quantity and quality of the photographs. If you're a picture person, this book is huge. It's got like full color photos on almost every page. And I gotta say, tell me about how did you are these all photos like from the archives, from the museum?
These photos came from all over. So there was a number of them are owned by the museum. There was a gentleman named Jeremy Winkworth who he lives in Michigan. He was a career Upjohn employee, and he was the person without whom I could not have done this. He is the expert on the Upjohn company. I know the stuff about Disneyland specifically, but as far as like the, you know, company operations side, I know enough that I could talk about it, but he is the expert. And when the Upjohn company was acquired in 95, he had personally salvaged, like literally boxes in his car of as many records as he could that were set to be just discarded because he saw this is history that is really worth saving. And so like he became like this guerrilla historian and just went and like just snatched up boxes of documents and records. And now he has like this very strong archive of Upjohn's history. So he was really helpful in that. And a lot of the photos did come from him that were Upjohn's originals that he had salvaged. Beyond that, there was a lot of help from a lot of places. I mean, there's a number of repositories in the West Michigan area that have good photos. I mean, Western Michigan University's archives has a good deal of Upjohn materials. A lot of the photos came from a place called the Gilmore Car Museum, which is also in West Michigan. Don Gilmore, besides being the head of Upjohn, was an avid car collector. And so he started the Gilmore Car Museum, which is fabulous if you're ever out in West Michigan. But of course, being that it's, connected to Don Gilmore, they also have a great trove of photographs of Walt's visit to Kalamazoo to see Don Gilmore. So, I mean, there was a number of places these came from. Some private collectors, other Disney historians were gracious enough to share them with me. But it's particularly the photos from the Gilmore Car Museum were really exciting because even again, avid Disney fans, there's a lot of people who are like, I've never seen these before. I thought I'd seen every picture of Walt. I've never seen these before. So it was kind of like this revelation to all of a sudden, like, wow, there's this whole tranche of photos that hardly anyone has ever
Yeah.
seen of this person that everyone knows and is interested in.
Yeah. Well, it's neat. Like you bring up that point. There's, as we learn about figures from the past and people whose lives have been documented inside and out to find out that there's this whole other dimension of, of who they were and who their friends were and like who they hung out with and what really interested them. And, I guess that it just goes to show that I think we often tend to think of, famous people one-dimensionally because it's easy. We associate them with like one thing, but people are complicated and there's a lot of different components to what makes up a person. And knowing that Disney had that connection with a pharmaceutical company I is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So tell me more about the museum, the Coit Museum. So where is it and what's it like?
Sure. So the Coit Museum, that's actually a newer name for it. For a long time, it was called the History of Pharmacy Museum. And so it's at the University of Arizona College of Pharmacy. And the college opened in 47. That is 19, I should say 1947. But the museum opened a few years later in 1966. So, and it grew out of one man's collection, a man named Jess Hurlbut. He was the state board inspector of pharmacy for the state of Arizona for many years. And like a lot of old pharmacists are, if you know them, you know that they were all collectors. I don't really know why, but it's just a fact of life that old pharmacists always were collectors. And so Jess was of course one of these. Everywhere he went throughout the state, just in his work, he would come away with like drugstore bottles, little mortars and pestles, or whatever. He'd always come away with something, and he was kind of a talker in that regard. And so just through his day-to-day work, he amassed this pretty robust collection of Arizona's pharmacies as they were in the mid-century. And so when Jess died, it was like, well, what do we do with all of this stuff? He and his wife, they didn't have any kids. We have all this stuff. It's who's going to want this? And they donated it to the College of Pharmacy, which was still pretty new at the time, to establish the History of Arizona Pharmacy Museum is what it was actually originally called, the History of Arizona Pharmacy Museum. Quickly, that Arizona name was dropped because it became much bigger than that. But it over 40, 50 years, it grew and grew and grew and grew into a really world-class collection. I would suspect that it's probably the largest collection of pharmaceutical products in the world, I think.
Wow.
I mean, it's substantial. It's always been a part of the College of Pharmacy, but for most of that time, most of that like 50 or so years that it's been around, it was not really a museum in the way that you think of it today, because it was in a working academic building. And so really the museum, as it were, consisted of display cases sort of scattered around like hallways and lobbies and office suites, just wherever there was like a corner of a room that they could put a display case in there, that's where there would be stuff there. So it was very disjointed for many years. It was the stuff in there was terrific, but there was really there was no order, there was no like overarching narrative. It was just a mishmash of display cases wherever they fit, very scattershot. And so that's just kind of always how it was. And when I started working there, that was how it was. And that was the space that we had, and we didn't really have a budget. So you just kind of do the best you can with what you have, which was very little. But then I'd say probably like 2017 or so, we got a very substantial endowment from an alumnus of the College of Pharmacy, Mr. Ken Coit, for whom the museum is now named. He donated a large sum of money to the university, and part of that was earmarked for a brand new space for the college of the Museum of Pharmacy. And so we went from having really no designated space and no budget to having both things at the same time, which was a total game changer
You
to
guys hit the
have.
lottery.
I mean, it was a once in a lifetime thing. I mean, to go from essentially from nothing to whatever we really wanted. So there was a brand new space built to house the museum. It's a beautiful cutting edge space. And we had the ability to essentially whatever we wanted to do, he would sign the check for. And so I had a partner who I was collaborating with. It was myself and this other gentleman, Doug Reed. Doug Reed and I worked together for several years. mostly during like the COVID era. We were working to build this beautiful museum. Completely changed the whole trajectory of the museum. For the first time ever, we had a centralized space. We had a front door. We never had a front door before. We had, we worked with a museum fabrication company to build really kind of cutting edge interactive displays, all custom cabinetry, beautiful lighting. I mean, we really it turns out when you have multi-million dollar backing, you can really do some very cool things. And but it was really wonderful because it was a chance finally for this collection that always had so much potential, but never the means to realize it, to finally get to that point. It was like it was like always it had had so much, it could be so much, and all it takes is this one like injection of, financial support was really all that it took.
It's a very Disney-esque kind of situation, like little fairy godmother kind of thing.
Right, right, and actually and so in this new museum space, the Upjohn collection is the centerpiece. I mean, it's the crown jewel of the collection. For many visitors to the museum, that's what they came to see. Something that we always struggled with was, well, how do you get people outside of healthcare in the door? I mean, it's not hard to get people like yourself in the museum. You're already interested. You're kind of predisposed because you're in this world. But we were always, well, how do you get just random Joe off the street who has no connection to health science, doesn't really know about pharmacy, doesn't really care? Turns out that Disney's a great hook. And so because this collection was such a good pull, we put it front and center. And we actually used the idea from the Upjohn Pharmacy of that sort of then and now, the old exhibit versus the new exhibit. We did this as well, where the Upjohn collection is kind of what the museum begins with, but then immediately after, there's an adjoining room, just like in Disneyland, that's talking about modern pharmacy. Of course, we're not talking about 1955 modern. We're talking about 2020s, really cutting edge stuff that I don't even pretend like I understand. I let the experts, I let the staff, and I let the faculty help me do that part. I don't exactly know what pharmacokinetics means, but I can confidently say it as if I do. But yeah, it's stuff like precision medicine. I mean, really, we wanted to showcase what's going on now. Where are we headed? Which is just like what the Upjohn Pharmacy did back then. We also, we built a whole replica of an apothecary in there. It's experiential. Walk in like you're going into an old store.
Cool.
It was
Sorry, I'm just geeking out over the whole
whole
thing.
project.
So
I mean,
so here, so two-part things before we wrap up here. I really wanna know, first off, where is the museum, and, like, what are the hours? Is there admission? Can anybody just go see it?
yeah. So the museum again, it's at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So we're in southern Arizona, about 2 hours or so south of Phoenix, the main airport hub there. It's free to the public. It's open, I believe, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Since I'm not actually there anymore. I don't set the hours any longer. But yes, it's free. It always will be free to visit. You just go and you can just look around by yourself. You can take a guided tour. Whatever your preferred method of visiting is.
That's so cool. So I, I want to end on this. So, but you spent a good number of years at the museum, curating the collection, and you must have come across some really interesting items while you're there. So, in no particular order, what are some of the top, most kind of eye-popping, surprising, or just bizarre items that you encountered while working at the museum?
There's so many. I mean, so many. A few that stick out to me. One of the ones that I'll just never forget was there were a number of medicated cigarettes, which and this is true, were meant to treat asthma. So cigarettes for asthma. It was a wild time. We had asthma cigarettes. We have a number of bottles that were labeled for narcotic compounds, heroin and terpene hydrate as a cough syrup, which, boy, that would fix you right up, wouldn't it? And, bottles labeled for cocaine. I mean, of course, this is something that a lot of people would be interested to see. There's an item in there that's very unusual called a pill silverer. So this is again in this like pre-Upjohn day when pills would be baked. They would often be coated in compounds like silver leaf was a common one. And so there's this little, like, it looks like a little spherical wooden sphere that comes apart into 2 pieces where you kind of roll pills around in there with something like gum arabic, some kind of like sticky, adhesive compound, and then silver leaf to coat pills in silver. Of course, not really great to be ingesting silver, and we know that now, but they didn't in 1850. But yeah, and we also have to go with them actual silver coated pills, which are really, I mean, they're kind of lovely to look at. Also, would
Yeah.
not recommend taking them, but that was an unusual one for sure. We have some prohibition era prescriptions for medical beer and liquor.
Mm.
Medical, I use the term loosely. That was sort of an exemption to prohibition.
Yep.
If you
I actually,
do you have one?
yeah, I got one here.
Great.
So this is my Prohibition era prescription for whiskey.
For whiskey, sure.
Oh yeah, it's great. It's for yeah, it's like a 1.5 ounces 4 times a day.
For
60. Yeah,
for back pain or
booze.
whatever, yeah.
It's for whatever. Prescriptions for alcohol. But you had to get these government certified blanks.
Yeah, it's a great part of the pharmacy story. This
Oh yeah.
weird prohibition exemption. Of course, soda fountains, that was kinda how they became popular as, like, an alternative to taverns. I mean, but yeah, it's just part of this great story. To that end, we have a mortar and pestle. We have hundreds of them, of course, but there's one in particular that's very unassuming. You would easily look right past it and never notice it. It's this little white ceramic mortar and pestle like the ones you've seen 1,000 times that in very small letters says Coors on it,
Like the
as in
beer?
as in the Coors Beer Company. Because, of course, when prohibition comes around, all these brewing companies, that's threatening their livelihood. And so in order to survive that, companies like Coors pivoted to making other things, like, in this case, a pharmaceutical mortar and pestle. So it's something that, if you saw it, you would look right past it, but if you actually know the context of it, it's like, "Oh, that's a really interesting piece there."
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of products related to, like women's health, and like sexual health products from a time when that was very, very taboo. I mean, drugstores, if you wanted something like condoms or tampons, it's like you'd have to like ask, "Can I have like they'd be kept like behind the counter in a box.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, and it was a different time, but
Oh,
I
yeah.
find I find that stuff like that kind of speaks to more modern discussions of, women's issues in health and, sexual health,
Mm-hmm.
bias in medicine. I mean, there's all kinds of things that feel relevant about those even in this day and age.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's a great point because even as far back as, people could remember, like that's where you go. Most people today buy like feminine hygiene products and, sexual wellness products at the pharmacy. That's where the condoms are. And I mean, every pharmacist has like at least one good condom joke because
Sure,
that's part of our day. That's part of the
sure,
business, ma'am. It's there, and there is a healthcare component. A lot of people don't realize condoms have an NDC. These are approved medical devices. Like, and there's like stuff behind the counter that people don't even know about. I could do a whole show just on sexual health and wellness at the pharmacy.
yeah,
Blows your mind, but
yep,
but it's a part of it, and it always has been, even back when, like, condoms were illegal or, never discussed in polite society, but you knew, right? If you know, you go to the pharmacist and a lot of this is even coded language where, you're asking to be hooked up with the, and so that whole behind the counter notion of like, it's a product not on display, but I got it back here.
right,
And it's a safe way to do it. It's a safe and legal way to
right.
access what you need rather than, buying something off the street or whatever. And that really speaks to the trust component, of how pharmacists are viewed and their role as someone who you could trust for just about anything.
Right. I mean, and it does kind of speak to the longevity of the profession and how it's kind of always been like this like pharmacist and patient trust, or really at least that like it should always be like that. That this is a place where like you can get expert help, get questions answered by, someone who's a medication expert. It's just, and yeah, just that trust. And again, I think back to all these people who would tell me about, a specific pharmacist that they remember from their childhood. I mean, they kind of leave an impression. We had there's one another kind of very unassuming item in our collection is there's a specific drugstore bottle. I mean, I'm sure again, you've seen thousands of them, little glass bottles, 2 or 4 ounces that have the embossed label. I mean, and, like, there's zillions of them, and you can find them just in the ground, like, just buried in the ground sometimes. We had a whole bunch of them from various states in the Southwest, and we have an exhibit that we categorize them by state. So like a whole bunch of ones from California, Arizona, and surrounding areas. And there's one from Arizona that it says for a pharmacist named J.F. Yorba, and the address is Tucson, AT, which is unusual because the abbreviation for Arizona is AZ, not AT. The reason is because it is older than the state of Arizona. Arizona became a state in 1912. Prior to that, it was the Arizona Territory.
Wow.
And so, like, locally here in Arizona, that's a really cool piece. It may well be the only one of those that exists, and I remember once I had a woman come through who was telling me about her father, who was a pharmacist in California. I said, "Oh, yeah, what store did he work at?" And she told me it was a store called Bowerman's Drugstore. And I said, "Hold on. I actually think that I have a bottle from Bowerman's." And so I found it for her, and I'll never forget, she, like, just broke down crying. She was like, "This is so meaningful that you have this here." Like, it's just such this means so much to me that you have this record of my father and his work. Like, and it's just that moment just really kinda stuck with me, and I think always will.
That's such a great way to tie all this together because, regardless of who you are, the pharmacy is something that pretty much everybody has interacted with at least at some point, if not on a regular basis. Walt Disney was no stranger to that. And I'm sure there was a pharmacist from his youth that
Sure.
he probably remembered fondly.
Yep.
And so it's such a cool story and a great connection, and I'm really glad that the museum exists. Next time I'm out in Tucson, definitely gonna have to check it out. Well, that's about it for our show. My guest, Stephen Hall, his book, A Spoonful of Sugar, about the Upjohn Pharmacy in Disneyland. You can buy that online. Stephen, any final thoughts before we sign off?
I mean, I could talk about this all day, but I know we got a time limit to keep to. So I just appreciate you having me here, and I hope if for folks who read the book, I do hope you enjoy it. It was fun to research. It was fun to write, and I hope you'll enjoy going down these same rabbit holes that I had fun going down.
Thanks so much, Stephen. The book was great. Thanks for being my guest, and hope you guys enjoyed listening. Thanks a
Thanks.
lot. We'll see you later.